Good morning. A virtual welcome to County Tipperary. It's a lovely morning down here. I'm not sure what it's like in the rest of the country, but a good, nice, crisp November morning. And welcome to the latest in our Leading Through People webinar series. I suppose today and previously we've looked at how organizations can grow in times of change and disruption through innovation. And really that's driven by the people at the heart of those organizations. Today the subject is creativity as a skill set for the workforce of the future. So the industries we're in, it's really prevalent at the moment, and I think organizations are really starting to look at creativity and innovation as a driver for organizations in public sector, private sector, and not-for-profit as well. So we're talking about creativity today, and why is it so important? And I suppose I was doing some background reading, really, just from the World Economic Forum, and I suppose what they showed is that it's really important and for the economy, the environment, and for leadership within organizations. And McKinsey recently identified that creative leaders outperform their peers both in financial and innovation measures. And creativity can be the difference between a good and a great organization sometimes. And I suppose from a jobs perspective, in a time when we see a huge amount of, I suppose, talk about artificial intelligence replacing jobs and replacing people in jobs, but I suppose the research shows that creativity could be the thing that sets us apart from robots in the future. I'm delighted to say we've assembled what I would think is just a fantastic panel of speakers today to discuss this, and they sit really in fields that are at the intersection of business, arts, craft, and creative agency, and the arts and funding support. Firstly, we have Dr. Michelle Cullen, Managing Director and Head of Inclusion and Diversity at Accenture Ireland. Welcome, Michelle.
Thank you very much. Nice to be here.
You're very welcome. We've Rosemary Steen, Chief Executive Officer and of the Design and Crafts Council of Ireland. Morning, Rosemary, how are you?
Morning. Lovely. Thank you for the invitation.
Good. We've Kathleen Healy from Ringers Creative, who I just see has gone off screen slightly for a second, so we'll come back to Kathleen in a second. We've been working with Ringers Creative on our GAA partnership for the past, I suppose, nearly a year now, and they're really at the, I suppose, centre of that campaign for us in developing it. And I've also got Andrew Hetherington, Chief Executive of Business to Arts. Morning, Andrew, how are you?
Good morning, how are you?
Good now, good. So really what we're going to try and do today is talk, I suppose, about how organizations, one, can look at creativity and to grow their organization, but also to look at it from the people side and how they can develop creativity within their people, and use that to grow their organization. So starting with Michelle, I suppose, Michelle, you're like with Accenture, and helping companies with change is a central part of Accenture's purpose. So what role does creative thinking have in dealing with change, do you think?
Thanks, Colin. I think, even if you look before COVID, more than half of the Fortune 500 companies from just 20 years ago no longer exist. So change is happening all the time. Digital transformation of industry is having a really profound effect on business, but also on society, sometimes in ways that we see very clearly, and sometimes I think in more subtle ways. So at any time of widespread disruption and change, and especially now in the global pandemic, companies need creativity. They need to innovate to create new markets, new experiences, new products and services. And, as you said, we help our clients deal with change, predominantly using digital and technology, but coupled with that are the very human skills of empathy, creative thinking, collaboration. I mean, those are absolutely essential for change. So I think you're right, it's absolutely critical, but it doesn't happen by chance. So for me, it probably comes down to three main things. having diversity, so having people from different backgrounds with different experience and skills, means that you're bringing those perspectives to problem solving. And we place a big emphasis both on multidisciplinary skills, but also on having different types of people, different types of backgrounds collaborating together. And I think that's really powerful. I mean, the Accenture's research would show that a culture of equality is the single most important driver of innovation. The second thing was in your question, it's about creative thinking, and it is important to focus on that second word too, making space for thinking. I think too often in many contexts, we, as a society, we have a bias for action, just do something, but actually without taking that time and space to critically assess the problem from multiple perspectives, we will fail. And speaking with stakeholders from lots of perspectives, particularly users, is important to build understanding and empathy. And I think the third thing I would say is just making creativity a priority and having ways to prompt that. One of the techniques we would use in the Innovation Centre, for example, is design thinking. It's both a mindset, but also a way of approaching problems that starts with research on the user, really thinking about how do you build empathy and understanding of the users through research in order to approach the problem.
And I suppose you're a head of inclusion and diversity, and you just mentioned it there. Like, how do we get that sort of diverse thought into our organizations? Is there any sort of, I suppose, practical things that organizations can do to, I suppose, promote that, or that you see?
I think the biggest practical thing you can do is bring diverse people to the table. So, there's too many situations, including recently in Ireland, where you don't have large parts of the country represented in decision making. There's been a lot of attention on underrepresentation of women in recent decisions and how that plays out. So I think it often is as simple as looking around the table and making sure that you've got diverse perspectives, both in terms of people's own lived experience and background, but also the training and perspectives that they will bring.
And I suppose hearing those voices, sometimes those creative voices can be lower or quieter sometimes, and deeper thinking. I think that's really, really good. Yeah. Rosemary, good morning and welcome. Just before I go to Rosemary, on the right hand side of the screen, you'll see I suppose a chat bar there, so you can ask questions of us in there for the panel, or just in a general sense. We also have a poll at the bottom of the screen, and we're asking this morning, what factors do you think can impede creative skills? So 1, lack of understanding of creativity; 2, lack of developing and managing creativity; or 3, lack of senior management buy-in. So just to give us an understanding of what barriers we need to think about. So that's really a negative thing, isn't it? I suppose I'm sort of raising, but I think it's just to get an understanding of what's standing in the way, really, of creative thought. Rosemary, you've recently joined the Design and Crafts Council Ireland, and you've come from not a corporate background, but you know what I mean, a very commercial type background. And so what attracted you to the role there? I think it's really interesting sort of move,
Yeah, well, I have worked in a whole range of different types of companies, public and private, and I suppose the common role that I would have generally played in the companies that I went into was I was brought in normally because I'd be a type of problem solver, and I faced into some very challenging situations. And I found it fascinating the way that design, in particular, if used properly and applied properly, can bring solutions. And so I worked on a whole range of very large-scale public acceptance projects in both electricity, gas, telecoms. And what I learned through it was that if you have the right diverse kind of discussion around the table and people really dive into the problem and there's a full discussion, then solutions can really come quite quickly. But I also found in less diverse workplaces that actually people can cling to the proposal that they want for far longer than really society would want them to. And so as part of my role in EirGrid, I actually ended up spending a lot of time in Denmark because the European Forum on Energy was meeting there, and I was very privileged to be there. And a huge emphasis in Denmark was around design and quality of design and public interactions around design. And so when this job came up, I was just from a strategic point of view of trying to add value in Ireland around design and design thinking, but marrying that with our traditional creative approach, which, around crafts has been to such a high international standard. I just thought this is a brilliant opportunity to try and get this part of maybe our story a little bit more high profile, because I do believe many of the complex problems facing Ireland can be solved with more innovative kind of thinking earlier in the process. And that means, as Michelle has said, bringing more diverse voices to the table.
And I don't know, like, for a while, I have felt that sometimes it's just talk about this, you know what I mean, in a sense. Are we actually seeing things happening on the ground? And, you know, there's been, sorry, go on.
Yeah, no, it's been really exciting, because when I joined in February, and I was just saying earlier, my husband is a healthcare professional, so I see the absolute crisis that's happening in that sector. But for this sector, it's been a really interesting time of change and growth. So we set about a competition basically to try and capture what was going on the ground, because we were seeing a huge surge of companies actually adapting and innovating to try and keep going, you know, and that was it, they had to. And so we had the Irish Business Design Challenge, and there's a website we can probably circulate the link to later, but we had over 186 entries to that competition, which was just amazing. But the other thing that was really fascinating about it was how the public engaged with it. So there were nearly 14,000 votes from the public for those companies that they saw stepping up, innovating, adapting. And I do think the public is really, like, you know, they're strong supporters of the Irish rugby team, strong supporters of kind of sporting initiatives. I think they really want to champion Irish companies through this. And the other thing we've been doing was, obviously, we started our Made Local campaign, and that was the #1 theme on Instagram last month. And that's being driven by that community itself. So what I see happening is actually huge energy coming from the ground up in terms of recovery that maybe isn't being adequately reported in terms of what's going on in Ireland. And I really think it's very exciting, Colin, like, in terms of how people are actually rising up to manage this challenge.
I think you've hit the sort of nail on the head, really. And it's sometimes it's only true in times of sort of real challenge that we actually dig deep, you know. And I think an example really for us here in FRS, we're a cooperative, you know, we're around since 1980, but the last recession had, you know, severe implications for our organization, and we got together around the table in I think 2009, looked at things and came up with, actually we grew two companies out of it. One of the companies actually is a technology company in the agriculture sector called Herdwatch, which I think it's the first Irish company ever to win the Prince Philip Award for Innovation, and they got their award in Buckingham Palace, which was just an amazing sort of thing for an Irish company, I suppose. And we also grew our organisation, Turasnua, which helps, you know, unemployed people back into employment, as that came out of that. So those really challenging times sometimes are what drive us. I think. Morning, Kathleen.
Good morning. You can see me now. Apologies.
Yeah, I can see you now. Yeah. So can you tell us a little bit about, you know, you're probably at the coalface in terms of that sort of intersection of creativity with, you know, working with organizations. Can you tell us a bit about what Ringers do, and maybe a bit of your background, really?
Sure, yeah. So Ringers, we kind of set up in 2017. We like to call us that we were small and nimble, right? So kind of at the moment, and I think similar enough to what Rosemary has said there, it's actually been a huge, you know, time of opportunity, I think, for us, and being able to kind of adjust to things as they happen. So yeah, so we're, you know, a creative agency, we're called. My background would be actually in Rothco Accenture Interactive for about 12 years, and then joined Ringers as well. So I think for us, just in terms of creativity and what we're talking about, you know, creative usually in agency world, it's a word that's used, you know, quite a lot. And a lot of times it's spoken about as a department, you know, so there's the creative department, which I think is just so far kind of everywhere. Similar to what Michelle said, it's getting a multidisciplinary team together, different perspectives, you know, really working together and to kind of identify what the actual problem is and come up with a solution. I think a lot of times, and what's been done in the past, is you have a solution in your head before you actually really sit down and go through, well, what's the actual problem here? So with Ringers, what we try to do is to really dig deep and discover and identify what the actual problem is, and then come up with a solution. So a lot of times the solutions don't come from the creative department as such. They come from collaboration, and they come from, the team kind of working together in that. So it's been kind of trying times for us, but actually, we're able to, over the last while, we have clients in New Zealand, we have clients kind of all over the world. So we've had to adapt our process, to be able to deal with remote working, Zoom chats. A lot of times as well, it's collaborative, it's face-to-face, it's workshops, so how do you recreate those on Zoom? So it's been really interesting. We've had some, fails, big fails, but also some positives that come from it. It's been brilliant, for us. So
yeah. I think, and there's a really interesting, I think, point in that when you talk about creatives department. So, should organizations really go out, obviously you hire people within the creative space, within marketing departments and etc. So you're looking for that creative personality or whatever. But I think one of the bigger questions really is, how do organizations create that culture of creativity with everyone? And I think, Kathleen, when we talked this the other day, you said sometimes the best ideas come from the accountant in the room or whatever. Now, I'm not sure I believe that, but you know what I mean? But we'll...
I'd be surprised.
Yeah.
But I think it's just ensuring at the outset that culture is there. So we have a kind of principle in Ringers. It's called ego parking. So you park your ego at the door. Everyone goes in the room together, and we've got between clients, and other collaborators, that we work with. Everyone has a different perspective, and it's when they all kind of come together and bounce off each other. That's when you get some really great, really original thinking. So I think it's just to ensure that from the start, there's a trust that's there, but also that egos are parked at the door. And we really can kind of learn from each other and build, together.
Great. Andrew, can you tell us a bit about Business to Arts and the types of programs it is involved in creating and brokering?
Sure. So Business to Arts is a membership-based organisation, and we were set up in 1988 in the depths of a recession in Ireland, and at a time when Time magazine called Ireland the poorest of the rich. And fast forward 30 years, and I believe that creativity is part of Ireland's story of the last 30 years. We are an incredibly adaptable and fast-paced country, but our role is quite often to be a broker or an enabler of either connections or new ways of thinking between the arts or the creative industries and maybe the more traditional business industries. And we work with large organizations in Ireland, some of our main domestic semi-state organizations, all the way through to Accenture and the Design and Crafts Council, on very specific needs. But a lot of the time that is about the crossover between what might be the art sector in some people's minds and the creative activity there, but also the business sector and the creative activity that's there. And it doesn't come naturally to businesses. I think a lot of the time, as Kathleen says, there's a department sometimes there's no department of creativity in a company, but there are people that understand that creative thinking is an important part of maybe the DNA of their company, and they would like to progress its agenda a little bit more. And we regularly get presented challenges by companies that we'd like to introduce more creativity into maybe our personality as a company, or we'd like to explore ways that we can become a more creative company, and they might set us that challenge to see what we can do or what we can come up with.
What are the sort of small steps or those types of initial things that organizations can do in order to do that, do you think?
Yeah, I think both Kathleen and Michelle have said that. I think you have to sit down with the people that are involved in decision making, right from the very top of the organization down to the front line of the organization, and you will always be surprised by the ideas that will come out, and they'll look like a little bit of a crazy mess at the beginning, but they might actually over time, and they usually do, refine into maybe 2 or 3 ideas that are very clearly the way that a company can see how creativity manifests in its DNA, or why it manifests in its DNA, and then from there a solution will arise. very, very simple things like design thinking workshops, storytelling workshops, and then creative or lateral thinking workshops where you set an agenda to people to go, well, think broad, and then come back to us as you narrow down those ideas into a particular area. And I guess that's where we start. And we usually don't arrive at a decision, like Kathleen says, until maybe a couple of months into a full engagement session, so we know, well, what is the solution for this problem that we're presented.
And how do we, I suppose, sometimes I think when you read about creative, it isn't always linked with profitability or high performance necessarily. So is there a way we can get leaders within organizations, I suppose, to really focus on that, Andrew, do you think? Or
yeah, I personally think that if leaders are reading about modern kind of business thinking, they know that design is incredibly important to the agenda. They know that they have to think about it not only in terms of a product that they're developing, it has to be about processes that are within their organization and overall progression agenda. So how do we think of the new solutions if we're faced with the fact that the Fortune 500 companies of the past no longer exist? How can we make ourselves exist in 10 years or 20 years time? So I personally think the World Economic Forum are doing huge advocacy in that space, and design has to be part of evolution and thinking in modern business. And I think in general we're pretty good at it in Ireland, but I think we could do more. But it takes a kind of a groundswell. Everyone needs to understand creativity and its importance for their roles and for their organization.
I think that intersection, I spoke to Kathleen briefly on it the other day, between creative, scientific, financial, and leaders, it's a really interesting, isn't it? And you have this sort of push and pull, from on the production side and manufacturing, we'll say, and, lean, what I mean? And who's winning the battles in different areas. But I do think, those departments really are capable of really, actually, if they work together, more so than in silos, and we've seen that with a lot of our clients and employers. Like 20 years ago, typically everyone was in silos, and now, this whole area of bringing people together more to solve problems is becoming much more interesting, I think. Michelle, just could you tell us about the achievements of Women on Walls and, your interest in the imagery used around leadership and that? And I think there's a really, high profile sort of project, that I think impacted, all the different parts of society, from business and people themselves. And really, really impressive, I think so.
Well, thank you. I suppose it stems from, I really think visibility matters, and seeing different role models matters to all of us at every stage, and maybe particularly when we're starting out. When Women on Walls began in response to a very simple question, where are the women? Walking around the Royal Irish Academy talking about getting more girls interested in STEM subjects, and looking up at the walls and seeing hundreds of years of scientific advancement and humanities leadership represented only by men, and there had never been a portrait of a woman on those walls. Interestingly enough, the idea actually started at a Creative Minds conference back in, I think, 2015. But I think the legacy is that as you start to ask that question, you notice gaps everywhere. As you said, it's not just academia, it's not just business, it's politics, it's arts, it's media, it's sports. And I think when it comes to making the decisions that affect all of our futures, it's still too often that women's voices are not heard equally, or sometimes not heard at all. And so the walls are part of that. Who we see on the walls, I think, is part of telling us who fits in, who's welcome, who you're likely to see inside those walls. And so it tells us about the past, but it also maybe helps us to see ourselves in that space. And if the walls are only telling half the story, that is a self-fulfilling problem into the future as well. And I might add that the pandemic has brought even more male voices to the fore, and I think fewer women who may be in the room but not at the forefront of speaking about some of those decisions. So I guess the idea was, the underrepresentation of women in all science and humanities and other areas is hundreds of years in the making. So if we really want to change it, it's about really looking at, well, what are the structures that support this? Because it doesn't just happen by chance. So what can we do to really fundamentally change how we're thinking about this and to break down barriers? I think the magic, and Andrew has been involved in every chapter of the Women on Walls project, but the magic has really been the way it's helped to change the conversation, including for us internally at Accenture. I've certainly learned that art can connect people in a new way, and help us to find, commonality, or maybe a way of almost positioning us a little bit outside of the problem and having people literally stand back and look at it in a different way. Walls are often a symbol of excluding people, but actually subverting that and using what's on the walls as a symbol of inclusion and as a prompt for speaking about inclusion. I guess the first portraits in the Royal Irish Academy were unveiled in 2016, actually, for the centenary. And I remember Frances Fitzgerald speaking at the unveiling and really focusing in on that word in unveiling, because, she talked about how women's contribution to almost every aspect of history had been to in a sense, veiled. So it subsequently then expanded into the Royal College of Surgeons. There are 8 really powerful portraits in their boardroom now of groundbreaking women in the history of medicine, whose stories were lost to all of us, to women and men.
Yeah.
And very Irish stories that we're not told. And we'll soon be unveiling the next chapter in Dublin City University. But I think, as you said at the beginning of the call, it's something we can all ask more regularly. Where are the women? Or looking around and seeing, well, who's not represented here? Who's missing?
Sure, yeah. And as husband of an artist who's just created a whole sort of project and an exhibition on mothers and juggling motherhood and work, and how it hasn't necessarily been supported or is supported very well in our society, and for years was actually frowned upon. Do you know what I mean? I think it's not that long ago. Probably only, well, it still happens, but from the 70s of women having to give up their jobs. You know what I mean, in the public sector, etc. It's not a long time ago, but I suppose, Rosemary, just in terms of, and I think it's really interesting and important, and people don't really connect it sometimes, I think, in business, the importance of creativity, for the economy, obviously, but the value of design and craft in Ireland, and obviously the key sectors that design and craft is, and I probably wasn't really that close to it, but, when you look at, students coming out of NCAD on product side and that type of thing, and how it sort of filters through, everything we really do, I think if you could talk a bit about that would be great.
Well, look, when I joined DCCI, I suppose one of the things that struck me was that we don't actually have a huge amount of economic data around it. So I've gone to tender actually, and we have had a really good range of expressions of interest in terms of getting new data on the economic impact. So hopefully I'll have that by the middle of next year. At the moment, based on the kind of 2016 stats, we'd be 400 to 500 million, but I think it's much more than that, because in terms of the savings, if design is appropriately applied to kind of issues in the planning system or anything else, I just don't think we're capturing all of that at the moment. I like to think of the sector that I'm in now as employing the equivalent of an Intel. So at times, when the impact of Intel is discussed in terms of the Irish economy, it's well understood, but the craft and design sector would actually employ the same, if not more. And I think at times, that can be missed by policymakers in terms of a lot of these individual makers and the impact that they have on their communities across the country. And the other interesting thing, and we've been trying to get this across as part of the Made Local campaign, is that every €100 that you spend with these locally created products is actually worth 500 to the local economy. So the multiplier effect in terms of the way that these businesses operate at a kind of an organic level across the economy is actually really important. And I have to say as well, there's a striking number of women leading, these micro enterprises, which makes me wonder what is happening in our corporate world in terms of why it's so difficult for women to get through. And look, I think you're showing leadership yourself here, Colin, by the fact that you have 3 women on the panel this morning. So just to recognize that, I think that's really important. But to be honest with you, it's more about that overall diversity piece, because what I've noticed in organizations that I've worked in, organizations that have few women also tend to have very, how would I put it, not diverse kind of communities in their workplace. And I think the issue is to try and recognize that it's part of how companies need to evolve now. If that community and that's outside voice is so critical in terms of product design, understanding what different communities want. And so it does require really quite brave steps from a CEO to say, look, we're actually going to deliberately try and hire, for that voice. And that can go down, in my experience, pretty mixed views in some companies. Like, I wouldn't say we're at a point yet where everybody in Ireland is embracing the need to do it. And so part of what we have to do in the Design and Crafts Council over the next, 2, 3, 4 years is get across the value of that diverse point of view in design thinking. The other thing I would say that's been very interesting about this situation that we're in, I find more introverted voices that normally wouldn't speak are speaking much more on digital channels. So I do think that one of the interesting things that's happening is that digital does allow some voices, people with disabilities, who may have slightly different challenges in a physical workplace. I think they've actually become much more impactful in terms of their presence remotely, because they're able to interact on a level playing field with people maybe who have different skills that they're able to bring to the table in a room where they can dominate a discussion much more. So I do think that one of the interesting things about creativity in this environment is how those skills are coming more to the fore from those more diverse groups that normally wouldn't speak up.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. I think there is a momentum there, though. I think there's still a challenge, but I do feel there's a momentum. They say never waste a crisis, right? And I think the last 6 months or 7 months, it's critical that we don't just sort of. We have a little bit of a history in Ireland sometimes of moving on quickly, and sometimes we push ahead, I think, and forget what's happened couple of years before. So I think someone should be taking notes on the last 7 months, you know what I mean, and sort of sticking them up on someone's wall, maybe in Kildare Street, and saying, look, this is what you need to do to improve things going forward, you know what I mean? So Kathleen, just in terms of I suppose you guys really work on some interesting sort of projects and problems, really, so could you talk to us a bit about some of those?
Yeah, well, there's the recent one that we've done with yourself, which was an amazing one. So the 70 minutes from home campaign, which has been great. And I think that was our last workshop on that, or really when we were getting to the core of what is the idea here, what we identified the problem, what's the idea. That was the day before. That was the day that lockdown was announced.
That's right. Yeah.
So it was a very, very interesting day. That great. We have this wonderful idea, and okay, now what? Matches are suspended, remote working, everything else. So I think that was quite an interesting project to go through production in lockdown, and we're in production on a few other projects as well, one for Bank of Ireland as well for their rugby sponsorship. So to go through that process where you're used to calling in, to studios to listen to voiceover artists, hearing things and seeing things on proper screens, how do you do that remotely? And it was interesting. It was at times, especially with my moment when it's not so good, it's very, very tricky. But we kind of came through it. We learned a lot, I think, from it. So I do think the lockdown definitely brought up a lot of challenges for us, but we were able to overcome them. And Rosemary, I think you made a very good point there, that just with digital channels, a lot of the voices that were a bit quieter before, it is much more of a level playing field. And, it has been great to see, through the process, just how people have adapted and, kind of come through. But, to be able to still keep that sense of collaboration, teamwork, on the channels was super important and really helped us get through kind of the projects and that. And I think, as well, Rosemary said, the great part that really drove, the campaign that she's been working on as well to promote kind of local and craft and that, it's communities. And I think what we've seen, especially with the 70 minutes from home campaign, also what we've done with Bank of Ireland, specifically around Lindsay Pete's story, is that communities have really embraced, both of, the creative ideas, connected with them and really pushed them that much kind of further. So for us, it's been an interesting time, but great results as well.
And just, I suppose, from we'll call it the non-creative side over here, over this side of the table. When we sat down with, I suppose, the GAA and Ringers back in what February, March, yeah. So, well, we've been talking about it. So basically, what we've been trying to do is how do we connect with the diaspora across the world, you know what I mean, and bring some of that talent back, right? So the GAA Go app is basically plugged into more or less every Irish household across the world, you know, so people watch the stream there. And the guys in Ringers came back to us with this campaign idea around, okay, and, you know, we're going to film 70-minute films of slow TV of different parts of Ireland. And, you know, in Kerry, it's basically 70 minutes of cows eating grass in a beautiful part of Dingle, you know, and, you know, we've 70 minutes of cutting grass in Croke Park, and we've 70 minutes of a fire in Connemara, you know. So I think they came to us and we're sitting there going, what? This is just bonkers. Like, why would you actually even think about doing that? You know what I mean? But I suppose what it did was, the big challenge was, and it's about how you connect with people, you know, and not interrupting them. You know what I mean? So basically every Saturday and Sunday for the last, you know, whatever it is now, 5 weeks, you know, people have been watching GAA on the GAA Go app. So they're watching the match, and then halftime comes and we give them a little snippet of the 70 minutes. So it's really important that connects, you know, and it's just been absolutely fantastic to actually see. But there's been it's actually in itself, the solution has created lots of other problems, Kathleen, you know what I mean? And how you sort of deal with that, you know, so it's been really interesting.
Yeah, but I think what was interesting, the only way we were able to arrive at that was, you know, through the process of, you know, rigorous kind of research, but not just looking at you know, FRS recruitment and what they do, but user research. And I know we've spoken about this before and how absolutely important that is, you know, understanding, okay, you know, someone, you know, an expat sitting there in, you know, Australia at 3 a.m. watching a match. What do they want? They miss that sense of home, that sense of connection. And to present a technique like slow TV was, it's you know, there was a lot of trust there, and it was brave, you know, I think as well. You know, for you guys, I mean, we were kind of going, oh gosh, how do we present slow TV and on Zoom? You know, but it was brilliant. The idea really resonated because we understood our audience, we understood you, and with a lot of help as well from the GAA, it worked out really well. But we were able to arrive at, I think, something that we knew would resonate with the audience because it came from them, you know, in terms of what they wanted. Yeah.
Exactly. Andrew, I'm interested, you know, I suppose, is this bringing creativity into your organization, you know, as an individual level, or you know, as almost not a contracted level, but just, you know, imbuing that sort of creativity in? And like, could you tell us a bit about your artists and residence programs and how they sort of benefit companies and what you've seen the output and I suppose results have been?
Yeah, we have about 5 or 6 active artist in residence programs at the moment, which are working well in a digital context as well. And essentially what we're trying to do is bring some of the skills, the creative skills of artists, into what might be the more traditional workplace where people don't necessarily see themselves as creative or may want to explore some of their own creative thinking. We have everything from a writer in residence through to a photographer in residence, musicians in residence, and they all work with companies on very specific projects. And it could be purely just about teams or team building and how they tell stories themselves, or how they create imagery that tells stories for themselves. Or it could be about partnering with other organizations. So a couple of companies may partner with a community organization like an older people's group or a local school, which helps, I guess, the age difference in their companies. And I think that's another thing that many companies are trying to address. There is a rapid change in the age demographic of companies, moving maybe from kind of the 40s to 50s down to an average of 30s. And they understand that creativity or creative thinking is something that is important to younger people, and a lot of metrics show that younger people self-select as creative as well as sporty and other attributes. But the artist in residence is designed really to enable or facilitate creative thinking, or to introduce it into teams or into a workplace. And it's not just artists in residence. We do other creative workplace programs like Forum Theatre, where we might scenario plan around customer service problems. And we'll talk about interactions, how you can build a type of approach to communicating with people, or how you develop leadership style through storytelling and forum theatre. It's a scenario. You have actors and writers describing the very specific scenarios of your company and showing it to everyone and saying, this is how we might deal with this particular scenario in our company. And then the other ones that I absolutely love are things like facilitating a storytelling session where people come and tell their own story and go, this is who I am, this is what I'm interested in. And I think that can be done really well on digital too. So when you bring in conversation, you learn more about people, you are more empathetic to their needs or what they're trying to do, and you start to see the connections in the company. And I think that's one of the opportunities of digital. Like if there is an opportunity, it's to tell stories and bring people together in a much easier way. We don't have to travel. We don't necessarily have to spend a half hour to an hour just getting to a place to do the meeting. We can actually do it across a territory, across the globe, and do it very, very well. So it's about bringing people together. And if we bring it back to that, I think people are the creative idea generators, and they come from all different parts of companies. And when you bring them together and ask them, well, we're trying to solve this problem, how can we do it together? And if that's facilitated by someone, maybe an artist or a creative, you will bring in other ideas. You will look at things that may be things that have never been considered in your company. And for me, that's the importance of the arts. It's about looking at something, dissecting it, trying to figure out how it's relevant to society and educate or communicate it to people so that they understand it. And an artist in residence program is a prime example of how you might facilitate that type of conversation.
Yeah, excellent. And we've just a mention from Tanya Benotti in the chat bar there around Creative Ireland and some of the examples of artists in residence programs that they have. We wouldn't have been able to advance our artist in residence program without the Creative Ireland program, which is an incredible program, and it's led by government. So it's government department realizing that creativity is a very strong need and agenda in Ireland, and it's also one of our talents, I think. And what Tanya's doing across society at the moment is an exceptional piece of work. So I think, and the reason I suppose we became a patron of business to arts was driven by, I suppose, in Turrisnua, like we've had nearly 130,000 unemployed people through the door, and one of the things we were looking at was we assess for skills and challenges and barriers, but one of the things we weren't actually assessing for was creativity. And I think what you find is with a lot of people who end up are unemployed people, they have diverse thought, they come from diverse backgrounds, and we started, and one of the key conversations we've had, Andrew, is around that, identifying that sort of creative, talent within people, and and the great look. I think it's actually a great week for the arts in the work you've been involved in, Andrew, and the proposal to government around, I think, the universal basic income for for artists and creatives. I think I tweeted about it the other day to the minister. I think it is actually probably the biggest opportunity Ireland has to actually lead in this area in UBI and universal basic income, similar to what we did, years ago in around plastic bags and, cigarettes, sort of being at the forefront of that, so I think it's really a great area for us.
Yeah, they're ambitious recommendations for the government, and I do think Ireland has the potential to lead in very many areas of society, and respecting and understanding the value of creativity and the arts is one of those areas. We are a small country, and we have the ability to help a sector that's going through unprecedented challenges throughout all stages of the 5 frameworks of dealing with COVID-19. it has a really significant impact on our cultural community. So now is the time to look at the problems, to think of the creative solutions, and to be ambitious in those creative solutions. And UBI is one of those solutions, but there's many others in there that are about actually facilitating the next generation of creativity, which is likely to be heavily digital. It's likely to see a massive transfer of artistic talent and some of Ireland's best talent into a global forum. So why not actually bring that to the table and say Ireland can connect with the world through creativity, like slow television that Ringers is doing, creating beautiful meditative television for people to watch in their own time, in their own way, and to reconnect with the country or the land that they love. So there's opportunities, but it's very difficult. But I think it takes a big step from lots of people to try and get to the point of what is the solution.
Michelle, just in terms of the importance of creative skills for the actual workforce itself of the future, what are your thoughts on that, and how do we actually, develop those sort of skills within people, do you think?
I mean, I think before this conversation, I believed creative skills were really important, but after this conversation, I'm more convinced than ever. I think it's not just work that's changing, but the way in which we learn, the way in which we consume media, how we collaborate, how we communicate. I mean, everything, even just in the last 9 months, has changed. And it's been really wonderful listening to the examples that have come up this morning of the very positive ways in which community has come to the fore. Diverse voices have a more level playing field. I think one of the other positives is the widespread adaptation of technology for remote working. I mean, that has a lot of potential to change the way that we work positively long into the future. But the future of work is always going to be about people. And as we've seen, even from our research, roles and tasks are changing and will continue to change. But across almost every single industry, the combination of complex reasoning with, technical and STEM skills and the fluency in data, but also creativity, it's increasingly relevant. And for new solutions, we just need this new thinking. The so-called soft skills really are the skills that we need for the future. It's also going to be increasingly about humans and machines working together. And I don't mean that just robots, although perhaps some situations will be robotics. But artificial intelligence, technology disciplines, all of those skills will be critical. But though they will enable us to double down on our human sensibilities. And I think in this complexity, it's that human interpretation and humanity that makes the difference. If you think about how we have all become experts in analysing COVID trends and looking at a certain recent election, the ability to become data analysts, to understand more and more information, to deal with that complexity in everyday conversation with our family. The way that we have become fluent in this is incredible. And that availability of data from everywhere is only going to get better and better at enabling us to use new visual tools to represent data, to change how we communicate. So I think core degree specializations in technology and so on will always be hugely important. But just as we were talking earlier about the best creative ideas don't necessarily come from creatives, similarly, we will have technology skills across all disciplines. And I think, even a call like this today, or for most of us at work, we've become TV presenters in our work. We've become set designers. We're all having to bring those skills to our everyday meetings. The ability to do that isn't automatic. So those are the new creative skills we need to learn. The ability to bring people along with you. Yes, it levels the playing field, but it creates new disadvantages for people as well. So thinking about how we counter that in an environment where, effectively we're all required to be public speakers. And I think as well the pressure of that on people. Today's problems are complex. Even before this pandemic, our research in the UK would have found that 9 out of 10 employees in the UK had been touched by mental health challenges. The OECD, I think, estimated the total cost of mental ill health at over €600 billion across the EU. And that's only the financial cost. So we do need creative solutions as a society, and we need to think about new ways to alleviate some of that. Where the slow TV ideas, all of those new ways that we think about how do we reground ourselves and reconnect.
I think it's interesting because Accenture really are at the center of that analytics sort of, and have always been really, really strong in that area. And it's probably, but I think it's again, it's interesting where creativity and marketing was about that shiny colors and, oh, let's make something nice and that, whereas at the back of it, and we talk to Kathleen more or less weekly, what's this delivering? What's the output? What's the results? You know what I mean? And I think with technology, we've actually been able to do that. I wrote a paper, part of my master's on artificial intelligence, and I think there's this big fear, but actually it's an enabler rather than a threat if you look at it in the right way. But certainly as a country, we've got to be, I think, you know, and as a society, developing those creative skills in our students and school children right the way up, you know. So Rosemary, what are your thoughts on that area? You're just on mute yet. Yeah.
Tanya has just mentioned actually about the Big Idea pilot, which we're involved with as well, and Creative Ireland, and about basically for transition year students looking at this space. And I really think that that's an important aspect of bringing the educators into these discussions on how we can bring that forward in the second level piece. We had a transition year student with us over the last couple of weeks, and I have to say they were brilliant because they were talking to us about new ways of connecting with teenagers. And sometimes, you know, that voice, even being in the room, and encouraging how that voice can interact into organizations such as ours. If the educators would get behind that, I think that could be a whole new wave of kind of talent also coming into the system. So, you know, just to highlight that, I think that transition year aspect is going to be an increasingly important thing to look at. So that we're delighted to be involved in that as well.
No, excellent. Yeah, and I think that I remember being at a conference a couple of years ago about someone spoke about, and this is 10 years ago now, about, you know, kids wanting to be alone together. And what I see at home and in my house is kids actually, our kids started connecting, and the pandemic hasn't actually affected them as much. Now, look, they need support and, you know, all that, you know, but I think they're much more enabled in terms of tech, you know, to actually connect and work through tech. And, you know, look, to be honest, most days I'm looking for a problem solved in terms of Zoom or something else. They're the ones that are gonna fix it, you know. So I think in terms of you know, nurturing and I suppose identifying and nurturing talent, Andrew, have you any thoughts on that? Really, how organisations can do that, you know, along the way?
Yeah, I personally think that there's a piece of work around recruitment to identify creativity as a skill set that's needed, or that it becomes more measurable, that it's part of the recruitment process. I think we will see that happen, and a lot of the job specifications that I read now already have creative thinking as part of the spec. But I don't think it's necessarily measured or it's enabled as soon as someone may start their career or may progress in their career. So I think if I was to encourage people, I would think about, well, how do you enable or how do you develop creative thinking within your company if it's important to you? And that's not something that is natural for a company, but giving space to think about creativity, giving space and permission to people to go, well, what is the solution that you might like to brainstorm and create a solution with us? For the challenge that we face as a company is something that needs to be a little bit more formalized. So maybe actually taking time, maybe once a quarter, once every couple of months, where a team is enabled to go and do that. And we're already seeing that there's lots of kind of innovation labs that exist within companies all around Ireland, but maybe the processes around that being part of a formal kind of HR policy is something that I'd love to see a little bit more. And if there were examples of people watching who measure creativity as a skill within their workplace, I'd love to hear it. But I do think we're going to go through a phase maybe over the next 10 years where rapid creative thinking and solutions becomes much more part of working day. And I think the last couple of months is a prime example where rapid solutions have had to be enacted very, very quickly, but there's been no measurement of it. And what are the solutions? How did we come to that? Who were the people that were involved? And do they feel more empowered to do that now as a result of going through this phase? But yeah, it comes back to HR policy, in my opinion. Measure the skills that you need in your teams and try to develop them as well.
Not always easily moved, Andrew. No.
No.
But I think it is actually becoming, in fairness to, HR leaders that we would interact with, they are definitely seeing this as a, the way forward, So Kathleen, how do we do you think, nurture that sort of creative sort of talent within our organizations?
Yeah, I think, to Andrew's point, permission is that's a starting block, having kind of an open environment by which you're encouraged and actually rewarded for doing so. To me, I think, and it sounds very, very simple, but the biggest piece is curiosity. That's what we need, is curiosity. Ask questions, ask loads of them, and continue to ask questions. But in tandem with that, listen as well. And I think it's just listening to all of the different people, in, an organization around you, outside of you. The one big challenge that we've had at the moment, and I don't have a solution to it yet, so if anyone does, I'd be really happy to hear. But what we're missing, or what I find we're missing, so it's those moments, you look at Steve Jobs, you look at Pixar, how offices are designed. It was to have those moments where you bump into someone that you wouldn't normally in a lift or in a hallway, and you have that conversation that just reframes maybe something that you're thinking, or a problem that you have, or an idea you have. So it's those moments that I find at the moment, it's really tricky because they're not happening as often. So, we're trying to recreate that through different Slack channels or WhatsApp, or, just those kind of random, we do a Slack roulette, kind of almost like a chat roulette where you don't know who's going to wind up on the other side. So to me, it's trying to find, trying to encourage curiosity, but also as well, just making sure that you're always kind of outside of your comfort zone and meeting different people and, just chatting, and listening. To me, that's the most important piece,
I think
but if anyone has an answer,
unfortunately not yet, because I think one of the challenges we see actually, and it's sort of counterintuitive, younger people are better, like you would think, at the technology, but aren't enjoying remote work really. Do you know what I mean? So particularly in their early 20s, like someone said to me last week, oh, well, when I was 20, I didn't go to work for work. You know what I mean? I went to work for the social bit. That social interaction is one of the key things we're sort of missing, which feeds into the creative bit and those ideas and that type of thing. And I remember years ago, my parents and my uncles working in organizations where they used to have the ideas box and that sort of stuff. And, it's how do you sort of, extract those sort of ideas, from people, So just finally, Michelle, and we're coming close to the end, probably about 5 minutes left, but creativity, your leadership style, is being creative part of that, do you think, or is it a natural thing, or did you have to work on that, or?
Kind of cringing at the question. I'm intrigued by Andrew's comment that young people would often put creative as one of their skills. So I don't know if it's part of my leadership style. It's certainly part of my work life. I do have a very diverse team. We do make time for creativity and different design workshops, form thinking, and so on. So we use tools like that, and I definitely rely on the creativity of the team I work with. I mean, it's part of our everyday in that sense. I think I'm continuously very impressed by those people at all levels in the organization who are creative. I mean, I'm on the interview panel for our graduate hires every year, and a number of us share that out. But the caliber of our graduates is just astaunding, and I think that's, I'm definitely impressed by that.
Has there much change in the last few years? Like, say, over the last 5 or 6 years, has there been much change in what you're seeing coming in front of you, or is it sort of just?
It's hugely impressive. I think young people, maybe it's linked to what Andrew said. I mean, that desire to not only be good at the academic side of whatever it is that you're doing and to do incredibly well there, but the contribution back to the community of the university, the involvement in clubs and societies and in charity work. I mean, just the breadth of areas that that young people engage in is hugely impressive. To the curiosity point as well. I mean, I definitely learn learn a lot from those I work with. I love reading and I love social media. I mean, Twitter is great for new ideas and new topics and bringing new journals and so on that you might not have a specialist education in, but learning about new topics I think is great, and that's, you know, a great way to feed that curiosity point, I guess. And I suppose I've seen the power of the arts to connect people through projects like Women on Walls. So I think just exactly as you said, being open and curious and allowing space for it.
Yeah, I think one of the things that people miss sometimes around the future of work is that we're starting to work in different ways. Like, so the gig economy, contracts, you know, like I did a talk last week to a group of people around the changes. Like, my parents had, you know, 2 jobs in their lives. I'm probably going to have, you know, hopefully no more jobs, but you know, you're talking 6 or 7 for that sort of age group. But our children are going to have probably, they're not really going to have jobs, you know what I mean? They're going to have gigs, you know what I mean? And I think, you know, it's something I talked to Andrew about before, is we can learn a lot from creatives and artists about how to survive and grow in that sort of gig economy, because they've been there effectively since the start, really, haven't they, Rosemary? So have you any thoughts on that?
Well, I suppose it's about an attitude as well, isn't it? It's a kind of always looking forward, always looking up approach. And many of our artistic community have been, you know, excelling in trying to adapt. And, you know, the report you mentioned earlier is a really good example, I think, of that community coming together. Very diverse group, very strong discussions, I'm sure, around the table, but coming out with kind of practical kind of recommendations. And I suppose part of what I do think the government has got right, just to give a little bit of praise, was putting in place the payments both for companies and for social welfare that kind of managed the crisis through the summer and gave people that time to respond and get their thoughts together. So I do think, in fairness, government policy now needs also to get into that space in the arts and address those issues quickly.
Very good. So we're just past 9. So it's been, I think, a fantastic conversation, like really great examples, and I suppose you know, of how we can improve, I suppose, creativity in our organizations and foster it and grow it. Just in terms of the poll we did, we asked, what factors do you think impede creative skills? So a third think lack of understanding of creativity holds that back. Over 50% think lack of developing and managing creativity, and then a lack of senior management buy-in. So I think that developing and managing creativity area is obviously important. Instead of, I think, looking to hire and say, oh, we need to hire creative talent, it's about putting that infrastructure in place, I think, isn't it, to sort of allow that to happen and to actually organically foster creativity throughout the organization and each individual, you know. So it's been absolutely fantastic, I think, and eye-opening for me, really, to talk to you all. So Michelle, really thanks a million for coming on board. Realize you're absolutely up the walls, you know what I mean, in terms of you know, busy and that. So it's really we're really thankful for you for coming on board. Rosemary as well, great to hear it from the, I suppose you're sitting in a slightly different area, but I think it's really interesting where you're sitting in that driving that sort of craft and creative area, which is probably the access point to a lot of organizations and companies, you know, and the initiatives you have are just fantastic. Kathleen, I'll probably be talking to you later on today again. Hopefully everything going smoothly and Andrew, many thanks for your help in organising today and having a more diverse group of, I think, you know, attendees, you know, from the arts area, from business, from not-for-profits. I think it's just really fantastic, and having that conversation ongoing. I would recommend for organizations to have a look at the Business to Arts website. We've been involved for a couple of years now, and I think there's fantastic work going on. And I think at a sort of a high level, I think it's really critical we support the arts. You know, it's the area really that's been affected the most in our society, you know, from from those creatives and artists and musicians and people working in the sector. And for government, I think, although they have helped businesses, and I think the wage subsidy scheme and put payments and things have helped, those individual artists need government support and all our support. So I think for Christmas, if anyone's buying presents or corporate gifts or whatever, look local, and it's an opportunity for us to support those individual great artists and creatives around the country. So
thanks for having us, and good ambassadorial role there. Support local talent. Thank you for doing that. And if you do need to know more, follow it. What's the hashtag, Rosemary, for your campaign at the moment?
It's Made Local. Love What You Give is the subtitle, but Made Local on Twitter.
Great.
Instagram. Thank you.
Great. Look, great to talk to you all, and we'll talk again soon. Okay. God bless.
Thank you very much.
Bye. Thank you for having me. Bye. Bye.